This only happens in this country and nowhere else. Nowhere else do little kids go to school thinking that they might be shot that day. Nowhere else does that happen except here in the United States of America, and it is a choice. It is our choice to let it continue.
That was U.S. Senator Chris Murphy making an emotional call after 19 children and 2 adults were killed in a shooting at a Texas elementary school on May the 24th. 10 days before that, a white man driven by racism killed 11 African Americans at a supermarket in Buffalo of New York State. Around the same time, the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 reached 1 million, less than 2.5 years after the nation recorded its first COVID-19 death. From gun violence to the COVID-19 pandemic, from hate crimes to police brutality, the U.S. has built its human rights record on huge human costs. In its 2021 Country Reports on Human Rights Practices released in April, the country boasted that the Biden administration has put human rights at the center of U.S. domestic and foreign policy. But the numbers tell a different story. According to Gun Violence Archive, a nonprofit research group, as of May the 31st, the U.S. has already seen 230 mass shootings and over 32,000 people have been killed or injured in gun-related incidents in 2022. Gun violence has touched every piece of American life. People were shot in schools, grocery stores, churches, and other places where they were just living their lives. The right to life is the biggest human right, yet the U.S. has failed to protect that for decades due to political impasse. In the past 25 years, the U.S. federal government has not adopted a single gun control act. On the contrary, the nation is putting more guns into more hands. The U.S. has the largest number of privately owned guns in the world, with 120 guns per 100 Americans. The year of the COVID-19 pandemic have seen the greatest gun sales in U.S. history. According to SafeHome.org, more than 21 million guns were sold in 2020 and another 18.8 million sold in 2021. Repeated calls for stricter gun control with recurring gun crimes have become a national shame. Given the nation's deeply entrenched political division, stopping the cascade of carnage would be an impossible challenge. Just 3 days after the Texas shooting, the National Rifle Association, the U.S. largest gun lobby, held its annual convention in Houston. Speakers at the convention, including former U.S. President Donald Trump and other Republicans, rejected the idea of gun reform. When you look back at the U.S. response to the COVID-19 pandemic, you'll find a parallel story. An analysis of the University of Southern California and the Princeton University reported that deaths caused by COVID-19 have reduced Americans' overall life expectancy by 1.13 years, the largest single-year decline in at least 40 years. Ashish Jha, the White House coronavirus coordinator, warns that if Congress fails to act now, it would cause a lot of unnecessary loss of life in the fall and winter. Despite all that, efforts in Washington to fund COVID-19 response have run aground amid deep chasms between Republicans and Democrats. U.S. lawmakers have grown numb to preventable tragedies and turned a blind eye to the fact that the American people, especially certain communities, are bearing the brunt of their irresponsibility. May the 25th marked the second anniversary of the death of George Floyd, an African-American man murdered by a white policeman kneeling on his neck. Floyd's death sparked massive demonstrations across the U.S., but little progress has been made since. The Floyd tragedy continues unabated in the country, where white supremacy remains widespread and minority groups still live in the shadow of systemic racism and ingrained injustice. According to Mapping Police Violence, at least 1,144 people died in 2021 due to U.S. police violence, and more than 20% of those killed were African Americans. In a Pew Research Center survey conducted in mid-April, 32% of black adults said they worried every day or almost every day that they might be threatened or attacked because of their race or ethnicity. Around 21% of Asian Americans and 14% of Hispanic adults said the same. As a persistent and systemic issue, racism has permeated every corner of American society. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare underlying inequalities embedded in the nation's political, economic, and social fabric. Communities of color were hit hardest due to failed access to health insurance and vaccines. Data from the U.S. CDC show that non-white Americans suffer higher death rates. Among them, black people make up 21.6% of the total deaths, while they only account for 12.7% of the population. The U.S. is facing a plain and painful truth. The number of preventable deaths is rising, and no substantial change is on the horizon. It's time for the self-serving political elites to stop preaching to others and start examining their own conscience.